Thanks to Trinity having me. Thank you all for being here. Before I start, I actually just want to say a short little prayer for myself, just to center myself spiritually. So if you don't mind, just bowing your heads or indulging me. Lord, I thank you for this day. As we talk about this issue that, as was mentioned by Nick, has been mired in political dynamics, please use me as a vessel to speak clearly, apolitically, and giving your guidance and will. In this we pray, amen. This is my first time being here with all of you, so I want to introduce myself to you, get in a little bit into overarching scripture that themed and drove and inspired my talk today, and then I'll get into the science. And then hopefully we'll have a robust Q&A, roughly 20, 25 minutes of a talk if I'm doing myself justice. I was brought up in the church. My grandfather was a famous organist and pianist. He had a chance to play at churches across the country, even had the chances of playing with the likes of the Jackson 5 and Ray Charles. So really, really cool family to be brought up in. My grandmother, choir director in Baptist churches all across the Midwest. I'm originally from Dayton, Ohio, so we spent a lot of time in that region. Aunties, my mom, cousins, gospel singers, bassists, musicians. I was brought up in the church. And I also was one of those kids that went to church often, on Sunday, choir practice on Wednesday, and the like, volunteer at the garden. And that was really important coming from a low-income community in Dayton, Ohio, where violence and environmental issues were rather prevalent. So later in my life, I continued in the church, ended up establishing myself in a Chicago-based church, non-denominational, and at about the age of 34, 35, I finally started to participate in church directly. So I was brought up in the church in that way, and another way that I think is important to highlight my background is the fact that I spent 11 years working in the federal government, in the public sector, as a sustainability officer and energy manager. Even while doing that, I was able to engage in climate change and environmental related work. And the reason I bring all that up to you is the issues I will get into today not only have obvious scientific merit, but there are some hyper-politicized dynamics that I want to make sure we don't fall into the gaps of. And that being said, this issue has been over-politicized, and my hope is everything I say today does not trigger those kinds of conversations, but we can stick to the merits of the science. And having spoken with Nick and had briefly met with Charlie this morning and via email a few weeks ago, it's pretty obvious Trinity has a good handle on this. So I feel comfortable talking about this issue in this context. So what I'll do now, I'll give you some insights about some of the science. I'll get into some of the things that I think we could use to address it at a methodological level. But before I do that, I want to give you an insight onto the inspirational verse. You may have seen this one. Some of it, I'm sure, is familiar to all of you. And it is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. I'm using the New Revised Standard Version. And I want to read this out loud just so that we are ground truthed in the same scripture. Then God said, "Let us make humans in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." Why am I bringing this up? There's some important things I want to highlight. You may have heard this talked about by folks who are way more scholarly in theology than me, but I think it is important to highlight the fact that this verse in particular, God is speaking directly. And we all know in the Bible that doesn't happen too often. So whatever comes next is really important. And then the other part that I want to dig into a bit is this concept of dominion. What does that really mean? It means to have supreme authority over. And with authority comes responsibility. I'm a father, a husband, a professor. And when you have those roles, how you manage that power and that authority is really important. So What do we have authority and dominion over in this case? The fish, the sea, the birds, the air, the land. That means we all here have a lot of responsibility. And how do we manage that responsibility in these modern times, given the challenges? Not as easy to do as it is said. So one thing that I really want to dig into next is get into some of the science. Let's talk about climate change more broadly. Environmental degradation is another phrase that can be used to describe it. And one way that I begin to talk about it before jumping into the positive and negative forcing aspects of climate change is to first talk about the greenhouse effect, because I think it's important to establish our understanding of the concept in this regard. So the sun is the primary source of energy for the earth. Almost think of it as the sun being food for the earth, and the earth is a human body. I like to do that, at least in the classroom settings that I engage in. So roughly 30% of the sun's energy is reflected back into space. And that remaining 70% is absorbed by the earth in some way. And just like we as humans have to figure out a way to make sure that what we consume and how much metabolic rate and energy that we're outputting and inputting into our system balances out over time, the earth has to do the same thing. And when that balance begins to get out of whack, that's where you start to realize some of these negative climate forcing issues. And specifically with the greenhouse effect, we're thinking about the warming of the immediate atmosphere that you're in. So infrared radiation, that I'm not going to get into in too much detail given the time frame we have, but broadly speaking, we must emit the same amount of energy back into space that we absorb in some shape or form. So the Earth's surface is kept warmer when we don't do that by the infrared energy from the atmosphere. And this warming effect is known as the greenhouse effect. And the largest contributors to that are water vapor and carbon dioxide. You might have heard of these terms used as greenhouse gas emissions. When you consider that these greenhouse gases are the reasons why the climate is warming at the rate that it is, we have to understand what is the primary source of that. And this is a tough thing to say, especially in a state that relies on energy as much as the state that we're in now. But the burning of fossil fuels in particular is the reason why that is the case. On your horizontal axis here, you have years from around 1850 to 2023. On your y-axis, or your vertical axis here, you have billions of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, or in other words, greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, it's an exponentially increasing curve when it comes to the kinds of metric tons that are being exhausted due to fossil fuels. Now, I'm not sure my video is going to work in this case, but I do want to bring to your attention that from those years of 1850 to roughly today, we have this really interesting dynamic where we get increases in overall temperature as well as decreases. And this is where, when we transition away from the greenhouse effect and we start to understand the dynamics within climate change, come into play. So this is just a visualization I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we talk about some of these next issues. And as I made mention, you have this sun pushing all this energy into the earth. We're reflecting some of it back, but remember, we're absorbing so much. And if that balance isn't done well, we can make this earth sick, or make ourselves sick in effect. What are some of the implications? Here's an example. Here in our southern Australia, they reached 121 degrees Fahrenheit, breaking a record just in 2019. You probably heard some of this stuff in the local news and national news, but I will bring it to your attention. Just one more example I do want to talk about is about Pakistan. And the reason I bring up Pakistan in particular is China and the United States has been statistically identified as the largest contributor to these fossil fuel and carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And the people that are going to be affected most directly and first is probably going to be lower income countries located in specific regions. As I understand, Professor Susan Lozier talked about some of those interesting dynamics last week. So not only do we have to think about the science of it itself, we also have to think about the geopolitical and global responsibility the United States has when it comes to some of our decision making and how that can affect those in the future. So let's talk about climate change itself for a second. It's caused by the process of modifying that energy absorbed from the sun and retained and reflected. And then, as I made mention earlier, we have positive climate forcing. This is where we have things like radiative forcings that are trying to correct that imbalance that I made mention of. And when we are trying to correct that imbalance, that's where we get the warming effect. Australia, Pakistan, that I just made mention of. Negative forcing, on the other hand, causes cooling. So you may even get extreme cooling dynamics. And that extreme oscillation is where you get those extreme weather patterns and unpredictable dynamics that really can affect society and economics. Climate change acts to restore that balance between the infrared absorbed and exuded. And when we are trying to make that balance, we get things like droughts, heavy rainfall, flooding, rising global temperatures, health risks, and a whole host of other economic consequences. So I made mention, I will talk about some of the challenges that scientists face today. And we talked about politics. Really, we're trying to keep it apolitical, but it's important to at least acknowledge the fact that a society that we live in, all societies, quite frankly, are driven by some kind of socio-cultural force. And those forces often are as healthy as the information it has. And misinformation is something that we really struggle with here in the United States and across the globe and around climate change itself, as we are creeping to an acute point of action and challenge and understanding. With that tends to come an increase in misinformation. I have a chance to, and this is just a little sidetrack here, but I have a chance to do a lot of research with social psychologists, economists, those in the humanities, although I'm an engineer. And a psychologist would say, right when you're about to address an issue and it's at its peak, is probably when it's going to be its most challenging to get over. And I do think we are either in one of those moments now when it comes to climate change, or we're approaching that. Myths are a key driver behind why climate change is so challenging to tackle practically and socially. And I'm going to highlight 4. The United Nations has a list of 8 myths. If you ever want to dig into this, I'm pretty sure I'll share the slides on these, and you can click these hyperlinks and get into the details if you want, and we can also converse more during Q&A. But one of the first myths is that climate change is just a natural cycle. It is true, the Earth has its own natural cycle, but what we're experiencing, as hopefully the evidence was able to inch you closer to believing, is that the fossil fuels we're burning is exacerbating that natural cycle. The Earth does spin on an axis. It does have a particular zenith angle shift that over the course of hundreds and sometimes thousands of years creates new dynamics when it comes to its natural positive and negative radiating forces. That being said, climate change and the greenhouse gas emissions I just described to you, which is largely driven by human dynamics, human activities, is a reason why that balance is off. And this is just one example. The nitrogen cycle, if any of you are working in the fields of agriculture or farming or mining, you probably know what I mean. So that's probably the biggest climate change myth we run into. UNEP, that's the United Nations Environmental Program. That's right. That's where I got this source from. Now the myths obviously have existed well before that, but they compiled this particular list of 8 in 2025.
So they named it myth?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. 8 common myths is the way that they describe it there. Then you have carbon dioxide levels are too small to have climatic impact. And quite frankly, there was a time, maybe 50 or 60 years ago, where there was some debate around if that were the case. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence across the board from our scientists that suggests, and not only suggests, that strongly suggests Carbon dioxide levels, even small changes, have a huge impact on overall degree C dynamics, which I just had a chance to show you visually. So although carbon dioxide is a small fraction of the atmosphere, it's a strong greenhouse gas. And human activities, such as burning of fossil fuels, has significantly intensified the greenhouse gas effect. All right, let's continue on with a few other myths that I think are really important to highlight. It's just a few degrees, Celsius in this case, not Fahrenheit. So if there's just a few degrees change, it's probably not a big deal. Now, okay, it probably feels like 72 degrees Fahrenheit in this room now as a set point. If it were 74, we probably wouldn't feel that big of a difference. If it was 70, it wouldn't be that big of a difference. So I get how some folks can fall into the trap of thinking that few degree difference is not really a big deal, because 72 and 70 is not a big deal to me. But when we're talking about degree C over a global framework, on top of the really interesting dynamics between global temperature, sea change, sea rise, glacier dynamics, mixed in with the extreme weather patterns, that's where you get complexity. The way that I like to say is, if you think about maybe a very long time ago when you did the old high school, grade school experiment with dropping a Mentos in the Coca-Cola bottle, something so small can have a large reaction. So just think of it that way. Scientists disagree about climate change. This is generally not the case. We, as scientists, often do disagree about a lot of things. But the phenomenon itself is not what we disagree about. How to approach it. Does it have a 90% impact or 85% impact? There's always disagreement among scientists in that regard. So that's a healthy growth pattern when it comes to a concept as complex as this. That being said, over 97% of climate scientists agree that human-driven activities are causing the phenomenon we're experiencing today. So what are some relevant innovations? This is where I'll get into the science a bit. How am I doing on time? Okay. Still doing all right. And feel free to, because this is, usually these are entire classes. So if you need to stop me and just ask some questions, just let me know. But one of the ways that we try to address climate change, which not only, even though this is more of a church setting, I think it's important for me to also mention, by addressing these issues, this is not just a pie in the sky moralistic thing that we're doing. And quite frankly, in the church dynamic, I think being a good Christian is being a well-rounded environmentalist. That being said, there are real economic reasons and synergies behind moving in these directions. So the first is the adoption of renewable energy systems. What you're seeing here is a diagram of, on your left side, non-renewable dynamics. What is highlighted here in that red rectangle is the primary renewable technologies that you probably have heard about, but we are digging into and doing a lot of work to improve these days. Nuclear is one that Georgia certainly has a leg up on in comparison to other places in the United States. So this is, I think, a strong suit here in Georgia in particular. And solar and wind is something that Georgia is starting to pick up some speed on. Nonetheless, you got other types like hydroelectric. Tidal energy is something that we're really trying to explore. We're running into some issues when it comes to infrastructure maintenance in that regard. Wave energy is another one that's in that bucket. But one of the other issues with these energy approaches is that the ones that are more renewable tend to be more intermittent, as in less predictable. So when you have the adoption of these renewable energy sources, you're likely to have to couple it with innovative energy storage technology. And that's where you get into the interesting marriage between renewable energy and the emergence of technologies like electric vehicles and other kinds of interesting lithium ion and other kind of battery technologies. We could talk about that more if we get into it. Yes?
Yeah, on that slide, I should probably be able to figure out what the PV stands for under solar, but how is that different from thermal?
Yes, solar photovoltaic. So the difference between PV and solar thermal is PV is when you're using a very specific film and chemo energy process to translate the energy from the sun into usable energy for a household, for instance. Whereas solar thermal is where you take the energy from the sun to heat water that then can be used to either use the water directly, or it could be coupled with another energy system that then could be used for some meaningful purpose. So the technologies are in the same bucket, but if you are digging into the way that they actually operate and the way you have to maintain them and which materials are involved in helping them work, there's a difference. No problem. All right, so we have, I'm sorry, go ahead. Was that a question or just a correction? Okay. We also have a concept that's called the circular economy. You don't have to raise a hand or anything, but have you ever heard of this concept before? I'm just wondering how much time I should spend on it. So what you see here are representations of an economy that we exist in now and one that we plan to exist in the future. And the reason it's important to bring this up, it's driving not only business decisions at the corporate level across the world right now, it's also driving the way that engineers like myself design technologies. So the best way to think about this is the linear economy, what you see on your left side. Let's use this microphone, for instance. A lot of research and development went into developing this microphone. And when its useful life is over in a linear economy, I hand it to Nick, or Nick hands it to an AV guy, and it goes to its resting place. The plastic is probably thrown into a dumpster, burned and incinerated in some shape or form. Maybe it's shipped to a lower income or middle income country, and then it's burned in their community and gives them carcinogenic effects and ill effects, like in Malaysia, and there's a few other countries that kind of carry this burden worldwide. You can also think of food waste, which the United States has a really strong issue with. But what we don't also think of oftentimes is the fact that food waste also has greenhouse gas emission dynamics that are exacerbating the greenhouse effect and some of our weather issues when it comes to climate change. The circular economy, on the other hand, and this is where there's a lot of opportunity, is where we think about the components of this microphone before we develop it. And we already are figuring out ways to reuse the materials and the technology within this microphone for other systems once this mic can no longer work its initial purpose. And that's where you start creating new waves of economy. Somebody might just specialize in figuring out how to reuse the top part of this microphone and create an entire industry just doing that. And then hopefully there will be byproducts that turn into new inputs for other economic systems. So we're doing this right now with electric vehicles here in Georgia at a high rate. When we think about the batteries that we use in electric vehicles, eventually they may not be good enough to be in vehicles, but they might be able to be an energy storage reinforcement for your solar thermal or solar PV system. So these are the kinds of things that we are investigating now, and the circular economy as a concept is driving that.
I know this is not primarily an economics class, but thank you for mentioning these. And you hear about. So you hear about maybe on the left would be a classic definition of an extractive economy. And I don't know if the one on the right, does it go so far as to be a truly sustainable, or is it just less extractive? And I would also ask about the ones on the right. Would that fall under things like conversations about sustainable capitalism, that kind of thing? Could you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. You're right on the money. I wasn't going to make mention of this part in particular, but this is a little more controversial. I didn't plan to bring this up, but the question leads me to it. There is a direct conversation about the circular economy not being another greenwashing effort, which is what we've seen over the last few decades. And in alignment with the adoption of the circular economy, there are robust conversations about capitalism itself. And I'm going to skip these slides just for a second to bring this up, because you just brought up this question. So we have these 4 quadrants here. On your left side, you have skeptical and optimistic. circular society. And on your top side here, you have what is called a holistic approach and segmented approach to both of those things. So let's imagine this. Let's imagine we are in an optimistic society that is holistic. In this case, we would assume a reformed version of capitalism, not the version that we have today. And this is where we would aim to yield equitable prosperity that adheres to biophysical limitations. What does that basically mean? That means this side of the room gets clean water and this side of the room gets clean water, which, right. and what that also means is that I'll also charge you the same amount of money, or if you make less money as a percentage than this side of the room, I might actually charge you as a percentage less money than this side of the room. That's what that means, broadly speaking. On the other hand, let's say we were a skeptical society and segmented, which we're trending towards that now unless we continue to try to make this successful shift to a circular economy. This is where you would get a fortress CE. Rather than a circular society, you would be in a fortress circular economy. And this is where you would assume that there is no alternative to modern capitalism. And you would facilitate migration limitations, population controls, and frugality. And that would be a circumstance where this side of the room gets clean water and this side of the room just doesn't get any, or doesn't get a lot, or enough to actually support your family and till the garden or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And all of that is cooked into this sauce called post-growth society, as in thinking about economic growth in a different way, where it's not just the extraction of resources and the use of natural resources. It's also figuring out a way to quantify and value the economy to where the sustaining of those resources is an economic tool also. And then there's the concept of degrowth, which is more so of a term that is popularized in Europe and some other regions in the world, but it is taking hold as a concept here in the United States. In fact, I'm doing a panel on it actually in a few days. So these concepts are all driving the circular economy, and as scientists, we're having these tug of wars of how do we, for instance, I want the circular economy to be realized, but I know it's not practically possible if everyone thinks it's going to mean folks losing their jobs. So we have to make sure that this transition occurs in a way where folks get new types of jobs and transitions if we want it to actually work in society, especially in the US context. So hopefully that helps to answer that question. The other thing I want to make mention of about the circular economy real quick, before I move to closure here and open up for Q&A is supply chain challenges. This is huge, and there's so much opportunity in Georgia to become a supply chain connector, multiplier. So let's just use the electric vehicle battery as that example. If we have a spent electric vehicle battery, not only do we want to figure out how to recycle the lithium content to produce other batteries or maybe reuse that battery for energy storage, as I made mention of, we might also want to find other purposes for that spent vehicle or spent battery. This is where you want to think about the end of the life of the product deterioration. Where do we really find that threshold of how far can we let it deteriorate before it turns into another use? The reprocessing aspect is really challenging. If there isn't enough technological advancement within the region to process the materials, you're losing out on economic opportunity. That's where Georgia is right now with EVs, and then no market demand for secondary output. So if Georgia works really hard to recycle lithium batteries, for instance, and we become a hub for the country in that regard, but for some reason electric vehicle sales drop off a cliff, then suddenly you're in a tough spot. And of course, this is talking about economic theory to an extent, but this is really important to think about, not only with EV batteries, food waste, plastics, other kinds of technologies, almost anything you can think of. So, all right, let me get to the last few points before I conclude. These are other dense, I teach classes on both of these respectively and collectively. So again, these are really, really dense methodological concepts that I'm going to give to you in like a slide. But ways that we approach analyzing and quantifying all of these things I just made mention of. For instance, if We'll go back to splitting the room in half. Hopefully, we come back together right before you go to service. But this side of the room, for instance, could have less economic power than this side of the room when it comes to purchasing food, right? How do you quantify the entire side of the room's environmental impacts compared to this side of the room's impact and have confidence in those data outputs? I can quantify your land, greenhouse gas, and water impacts based on the food you purchased over the course of a year. How do we scientifically do that in a rigorous way? Life cycle assessment is one of those approaches. Life cycle costing is one of those sub-approaches that specializes in analyzing it from a cost perspective rather than just an environmental one. And something else that's called techno-economic analysis is what's used when you're really trying to understand what are the circular economic potential and implications of your decisions. So I can create a lot of scenarios of person with this much money, with this certain disposition and buying habits. I can forecast what your impacts will be over the course of your life. And that's how you can help policymakers decision make and help other engineers and researchers develop tools to maybe mitigate some of our worst inclinations, which I'll get into here in the last part, because I think this is maybe the most important part, especially here in a Christian setting, is really thinking about overconsumption. And this ties to some of the more interesting stories in the Bible, in my opinion. The parable of the rich fool, for instance, hoarding material for wealth, and that not turning out well. We're certainly can make connections between that and some of the greenhouse gas emission and overconsumption behaviors that we experience today in this country. In particular, warning against gluttony, cautions against joining those who indulge. So the circular economy and those who really care about environmental stewardship are sometimes going against the current of the existing economy and the existing social dynamic. And then lastly, really just taking only what you need, which really helps to mitigate overconsumption. And that's going to be a challenging thing, but the thing I want to leave with before we open up for final Q&A is there is some individual responsibility, but the science is overwhelming in suggesting that we have to create systems so that all of our individual decisions are easier. So for instance, if it's economically better for you to purchase something that is circularized and you know is actually going to be reprocessed in your local Georgia economy than it is to buy the quick thing off of company A that's going to get disposed of 10 times over, you'll probably choose the circular option, right? Rather than the linear economy option. But us as a system, we have to make that decision easy for all of us so that I'm not asking an individual to suddenly pay 50% more or 150% more to circularize something in comparison to a more linear system that costs 150% less. It's going to be, for most people, you don't have the kind of financial flexibility to choose the circularized system in that case. So that being said, I really appreciate your time. Hopefully, I had a chance to touch on all the issues that you came here to listen to, and I'm certainly open to more Q&A.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Bozeman, for coming here and spending this time with us. You did a wonderful job. More than likely, these changes are going to have to be led by the consumers because the politicians are just afraid to get out in front of it. So how can we, us consumers that are not scientists, better educate ourselves on the science? What are some sources that we could, there are classes in the evening at Georgia Tech, or there are things online that we can do where we can study that information and have confidence that it's accurate or facts as best we know today?
That's a fantastic question. And again, thank you for having me. I don't know if I've ever been, I know it sounds funny, but in all of my time, I don't know if anybody's ever asked me that specific of a question. And there is one very specific answer I have for you, because right now, as with all phenomenon and potentially economically changing phenomena, big business and a whole lot of other folks have grabbed onto the concept of sustainability green. I don't even know if we use the word sustainable anymore as often as we did. Green is almost becoming bastardized to an extent. And now the circular economy is becoming this new popular term. And though there's been one scientific discipline that has driven the core science behind all this, and they called industrial ecologists. That's what I am. There is an entire international society of us that rigorously develop the methods and approaches that we use to yield climate change effects, life cycle assessment, and the circular economy implications. So if you are looking for a beginning source to jump to, you want to first verify that the person is an industrial ecologist for the very specific things I talked about today. There are other kinds of sciences, of course, but industrial ecologists are really good at the circular economy and life cycle assessment work. And that would be a place that you want to get sourcing from. And then it's more complex because within every single society, like within every business and market, you have some people that are really good and they're trustworthy and other folks that might, try to cut corners and fabricate things here and there. So you obviously want to pay attention to the quality of everyone's work, but that's a good place to start. And of course, if I earned any of your trust, maybe you can use me as a source.
I am going to think out loud for a second, if that's okay, but I was rewatching Blade Runner 2049 last night. And it's actually really depressing in our current political environment because there's just pictures of trash spaceships dumping trash all over the earth, and that's just the future that depicts. But I'm also a Star Trek nerd, and so I think about like Star Trek: The Next Generation and how there's this hopeful future where people are fulfilled, but there's like renewable energy and like things are clean. And I wonder, like, I was looking at your slide on the holistic slide, and I guess like what I could really use, and obviously this is too big a task for you today, but like I wish that there was a map to get to one of those futures, like a choose your own adventure book that was, because it feels like we're picking every day, almost hourly, the Blade Runner 2049, where my kids are going to be navigating piles of scrap, and when we think holistically about systems, how do we incorporate social systems? So it's not just putting so much on individuals, because I grew up in the 80s where it was like, if you recycle that bottle, everything's going to be great. Yep. And that's not how it worked. We did recycle the bottles, and there's still a lot of bottles, we stopped using straws for a while, and maybe we saved some turtles, but that doesn't. So thinking holistically with social structures, like, is there anyone that has made a roadmap to the version of the future that we would all want versus the one that we seem to be choosing?
So the answer is industrial ecologists have created that roadmap. And sometimes just due to the amount of information is out there, it's a little tough for us to cut through all the noise here and there. That being said, the other point that you made that I find really interesting is, and it goes back to my point I made earlier, yes, we have to make individual decisions, but the systems have to change to make all of our decisions easy. To that point, corporations have strategically used marketing ploys and some of their lobbying power to convince us that they know our instincts are mostly, especially in the United States, Bible-based. We want to do well. We want to steward the land like Jesus would. A lot of us do, at least. And corporations play on that. Don't use the straw or use the paper straw. That's going to kind of disintegrate in your cup over 5 minutes. All those things that we're trying to do, and they're kind of, they're pretty smart. They know how to play on that emotional dynamic. What we do as an industrial ecologist is we don't just take a corporation's word for it. We actually then use real rigorous data approaches to quantify if that claim is actually legitimate, given fair assessment and study boundaries. So the answer is there is a roadmap, and the first step, in my opinion, is to be able to change some of the signal drivers of global domestic product to include those natural resource limitations that we all know that we have when it comes to some of our natural resources. So that's the first step to move towards a circular society. The United States, unfortunately, I think has some struggles figuring out where it stands when it comes to this issue. But I think economically, we're going to be moving in this direction as a global force anyway, regardless of what one single country wants to do or doesn't want to do.
Professor Bozeman, we've talked a little bit about the future and what might come in the future. What can we do today? What do you do in your life now to steward the land as Jesus would, that we can do today as we move into, hopefully, a more circular economy? What are the immediate things that you do that we can also do?
Well, there's two spheres that almost all of us are going to have impact in, especially if you're church-going folks like we all are. The first is, quite frankly, having conversations within the church itself to figure out if there is a singular approach that is apolitical that most folks can get behind. And what that would be is agreement on values, as in we agree that we are trying to foster a circular society, for instance, as defined by, and I have the citations here if you ever need it or something like that. If the church can do that, then it starts to trickle down, of course, into the homes, into the communities. And although we're not supposed to be talking about politics too much, eventually it turns into the way you decision make, which food you buy, what kind of capitalism decisions you might make, and as well as how do you vote. And that is the path towards systemic change if that's what we're trying to do. But we have to know what we're trying to change toward and also have agreement on what fears we have about that change, but we're still going to do it, right? I mean, we all go to church consistently. There's times where we have to have faith on something that we might not fully understand, but we're just going to agree. We're praying for that person. We're going to move in this direction because, that's the direction that God has me going down. So it's somewhat similar to that, in my opinion. It's not direct, but I think that is an important next step that we can make.
Are there minute actions we can take, discrete actions that we can take at this particular moment?
I'm one of those scientists that I want to be careful with that because I don't want you to think walking out of here you can use a paper straw and that's going to solve the issue. And of course, I don't think you would think that. But I would say the small actions have to be strategic to coalesce into systemic change. As in, you have to be very intentional about the small action of voting this way or asking or lobbying your church to do this thing and understanding that I'm trying to create a circular society so we don't have that 2049 Blade Runner situation. I'm sorry, I think we have one here. Oh, sorry, and in here too?
Yeah, two questions, if it's okay. First, could you explain just a little bit more about how the temperature got to be 125 Fahrenheit in Pakistan and Melbourne, Australia? Because I don't think about those places as having a lot of fossil fuel plants. I think about China as having all these coal-fired plants. Now, maybe they have just flat land without a lot of trees and shrubs and whatnot to absorb CO2. Second question is on a new technology that I understand is available for modular nuclear production, much smaller, much cheaper. Is there some real hope with that technology?
So to answer your first question, if you can think about that picture that we had where the sun was hitting the earth and we had that kind of atmosphere glowing. Before we start thinking about balancing the earth's sun radiation in and output, there was already a dynamic difference between the natural weather pattern of here in the United States compared to Pakistan. What happens is when those greenhouse gas imbalances intensify, those weather changes also intensify. So that might mean we could have negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit one day here in Atlanta, and then also have 150 degrees Fahrenheit in Pakistan. So that what you're seeing is you're going to continue to see these extreme weather variations intensify, such that we don't have the ability, and our infrastructure doesn't have the ability to adapt to the climate change as well as it should. So our physical bodies obviously can't do well if we walk outside and it's 50 degrees and then suddenly it's 150. We're probably not going to do well, right? We're all going to get sick. It's going to feel weird. The same is true for the earth. And essentially, we're just in this intensifying isolation period that's making the earth sick. And then, of course, it's effectively making us sick in various ways. To your second point, and remind me what the second part was again. Modular nuclear, yes. So there are some nuclear technologies that have been around for a while that we've been able to theoretically employ to reduce our overall baseline energy demand. That being said, there hasn't been enough political will within the United States overall to employ and try some of that technology out due to, Chernobyl, some of the more obvious disasters that we've seen across the world. I do think that's changing, and that has been changing, quite frankly, since about 2007, 2008. I think the attitude in the United States have slowly been open towards nuclear technology. With that, of course, comes hazardous waste management with nuclear fissures, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I think that's really the challenge, is how to manage the nuclear technology from an operational safety standpoint, which I think we have good approaches to overall. But what we don't have good approaches to is how to manage the waste. And do we create a 2049 situation where our kids, instead of trash, are stepping over, green goo, some sort that might burn their toes off if they step on it. So just to be imaginary, but honestly, that's the challenge that we have with nuclear.
Nick, I'd like to make an announcement. It seems appropriate at this point. What Joe has been talking about in this circular economy is very much the part of what we are beginning to talk about at Trinity in terms of our creation care ministry. And last week was our first class. You are our second class. This Thursday, we are doing a tour of the CHARM facility, Center for Hard to Recycle Materials. That is this Thursday at noon. We're going to the CHARM facility, which is at 1110 Hill Street, downtown. If you would like to come to Trinity and carpool from here, I will be here at 11:25 on Thursday. You just need to sign up. We have a maximum of 25 slots, and I'm not sure exactly how. I think we have a few spots left. So if you would like to go, you can either come to Trinity at 11:25, or you can meet us at the CHARM facility at Hill Street. I think it will be an interesting follow-up to what you're talking about. I didn't even know there were industrial ecologists, but I'm delighted to know that this is the case. Anyway, I think we will have a continuing conversation about all this, and I didn't want to take over the floor because I didn't have a question. I just wanted to make an announcement. So,
Sounds like an important one.
Quick question, Brad. I met a young woman recently. Tell us about that.
Yes, and although I'm not necessarily involved with that particular research, I do research similar to that. And there is the emergence of using AI technology to do a whole host of things, including being able to predict exactly how much and which types of trash can eventually be valuable to waste haulers and waste managers. And I used to work in waste management when I worked in the federal government. So yes, there's a lot of synergy behind that. And that is a huge driver behind realizing the circular economy or circular society, because it's tough for us to decision make all the time. We all have to be experts of everything. AI can help us kind of relieve ourselves of that, where AI can be the expert of, hey, which plastic number is this? Is it a number 5 or a number 3? Or which kind of food waste is this? Is this a decomposing bagel, or is it something more biodegradable? So all those decisions, AI technology and sensors can help us make.
Thank you, Dr. Bozeman. I know we need to wrap so everyone can get to 11 a.m. service. We will not meet next week. There's no adult education. The following 2 Sundays after that, we have Mark Douglas from Columbia Seminary coming in. He's one of the foremost authorities on the theology of creation care. So we're excited for that. After the weeks with Professor Douglas, we will have one last week where we'll actually have some of the creation care committee team talking about both what we've heard in these sessions, but what we're doing here at Trinity, and to some extent to mirror what we can do in our own households as kind of micro actions. So.
Thank you, Nick. And I want to thank Joe for a very thought-provoking presentation. And I'm glad that you are teaching young people things that we did not learn when we were coming through at that time. And perhaps over time, they'll be more informed and more able to deal with these changes that are going on. Thank you very much.